In the cold glow of the hangar lights at 3:17 a.m., the silenced prototype engine sat lifeless on its stand. Two lead designers had already failed to wake it in 12 frantic days. The championship qualifier was 48 hours away. Vanessa Holt stepped forward in her crisp navy Brioni suit, gold Cartier watch catching the light. She looked at the overnight maintenance tech who had touched the engine without permission and said, "This isn't your sandbox. Grab your tools and disappear." She had no idea the invisible janitor-level mechanic she had just terminated was the original architect who secretly owned the patents. What was hiding beneath all that silence? Elias Kane stood motionless for 3 full seconds, the echo of her voice still ringing off the steel rafters. He tasted diesel and defeat. Then he gave one slow nod, gathered the battered Leatherman from the workbench, and walked out without a word. The night air on the loading dock smelled of wet concrete and old rubber. He climbed into his 12-year-old Tacoma, turned the key, and drove the 6 miles back to the 3rd-floor walk-up on 14th and Elm. Inside, exactly 3 plates sat in the cupboard. On the wall above Sophie's bed hung the child-sized leather flight jacket, its sleeves still too short. The leather cracked where her mother's hands had once gripped the controls. 10 years earlier, Elias had been the founding propulsion engineer at Apex Dynamics, a $1.4 billion aerospace racing firm carved out of Detroit's old warehouse district. He had drawn the revolutionary thrust vectoring core on a bar napkin at 2 a.m. while his wife laughed beside him. Then came the crash on I-75. 27 years old, widowed, left with a 7-year-old daughter who still woke up screaming for a mother who would never answer. So he vanished, never claimed the patents, never corrected the records. He took the night shift maintenance job at $19 an hour and kept his head down while Vanessa Holt rose on the back of his stolen schematics. At 2:14 a.m. the following night, the same hangar felt abandoned. Only the prototype engine remained, cold and unresponsive after the designer's latest failure. Elias had been officially terminated, but the security gate still recognized his old badge. He let himself in. 1 battered Leatherman, 1 analog torque wrench. No manual listed the micro-bypass valve he had machined himself in 2009. He worked in total silence, fingers remembering every tolerance. 9 hours later, the engine coughed once, then settled into a perfect 4,200 revolutions per minute idle. The sound filled the hangar like a held breath finally released. The night watchman walked past, paused, and gave one slow, knowing nod before continuing his rounds. Nothing more. Elias shut everything down, wiped every surface, and slipped out before dawn. At 10:45 a.m., 2 security officers escorted him from the premises with a single cardboard box. Co-workers lined the hallway, whispering. Someone had already taped a handwritten sign to his locker. Sandbox closed. He carried the box down the concrete steps into the morning light. The smell of fresh coffee from the break room followed him like a taunt. Sophie clung to the leather flight jacket during another nightmare. At 1:07 a.m., Elias sat on the edge of her bed, rubbing small circles on her back the way she liked. "Daddy's magic hands can fix anything?" she whispered into the jacket's collar. The same words she had believed since she was 4. He kissed the top of her head and wondered how long that faith would hold once the bills stopped being paid. Vanessa ordered a full internal audit. Every access log, every overtime slip. Elias's name appeared nowhere important. But in a forgotten storage room on the 3rd sublevel, he found the original patent ledgers, thick with dust. He photographed each page with his cracked phone screen. 19 hours until the next design review. He balanced school drop-off at 7:50 a.m., then spent the afternoon at the public library, cross-referencing faded ink on the 2009 bar napkin he had kept folded in his wallet for a decade. The napkin still carried the faint smell of whiskey and engine grease. That night, the retired floor supervisor answered on the 3rd ring. The old man's voice cracked when he heard the name Ghost 17. They spoke for 43 minutes in low tones, trading pieces of a puzzle only 2 people still understood. Sophie brought home a drawing from first grade. A stick-figure dad standing beside a roaring airplane. "It always comes home," she told him at dinner, pointing at the picture with a grape juice mustache. Elias pinned it above the leather jacket and felt the first small crack in the wall he had built around his old life. The audit team found nothing conclusive. Vanessa sent a memo declaring the prototype still unviable. In the same email, she praised the two lead designers for heroic effort under impossible deadlines. Elias read the memo at 3:42 a.m. on a library computer. He closed the tab, folded the bar napkin back into his wallet, and walked home through streets that smelled of coming rain. Another nightmare. Sophie woke at 2:19 a.m., clutching the leather jacket so tightly the zipper left marks on her palms. Elias carried her to the window and pointed at the distant runway lights of Detroit Metro. "See those?" he said quietly. "Every plane that leaves comes back to the same hands that built it, even if no one remembers the name." She nodded against his shoulder, already half asleep again, believing him completely. The small victories kept arriving in the dark. A quiet phone call here, an overlooked ledger entry there. Each one a single RPM closer to the truth. But the championship qualifier was now less than 38 hours away. The championship qualifier loomed like a guillotine blade 41 hours out. Elias sat in the back row of the City Hall Records Annex at 6:17 a.m., elbows on scarred oak, while a bored clerk slid another banker's box across the counter. The faint whiskey and grease scent rose again as he unfolded the 2009 bar napkin between gloved fingers. Its edges were softer now. The ink bled in places, but the original circuit sketch he had drawn that night in the hangar bar still matched the faded patent lines he had photographed on sublevel 3. He traced the jagged signature at the bottom, his own, back when the company still carried his name on the masthead. Ghost 17. The clerk cleared her throat. "Sir, we closed the microfilm room at noon. Anything else?" Patent assignment ledger, 2008 through 2011.
Mikrofickerroll 4471.
She raised an eyebrow at the precise number but said nothing. 10 minutes later, the machine hummed to life. Elias fed the film, eyes burning under the green glow. At frame 312, the truth flickered past. A transfer document signed by a junior attorney at 2:14 a.m. on a Friday no one should have been working. The buyer's name was blacked out with thick marker, but the notary stamp beneath it was crisp. He photographed it anyway. The napkin went back into his wallet like a talisman. Day 9 was half gone and the design review clock kept ticking. That afternoon he picked Sophie up from school at 3:05 p.m. exactly. She climbed into the passenger seat of the rusted pickup, backpack smelling of crayons and peanut butter. "Daddy," Miss Klein said, "my airplane picture is going in the hallway showcase." Elias smiled, but the smile felt bolted on. He drove them to the public library again, the same seat by the window where the radiator clanked every 7 minutes. While Sophie colored, he opened a new browser tab and started building the shadow folder. Invoice number 4471, the original parts order from a machine shop in Hamtramck that no longer existed on paper. A retired machinist had kept carbon copies in his garage for 17 years. The phone call the night before had cost Elias 2 hours of sleep and a promise of discretion, but the scans arrived by encrypted email at 4:47 p.m. They proved the prototype's core geometry had been lifted from his rejected 2009 submission. He saved everything to a thumb drive the size of a dog tag, then slipped it into the same wallet pocket as the napkin. 17 hours until the next design review. Vanessa's team had moved the prototype into the wind tunnel bay at the corporate campus on 8 Mile. Elias knew the layout better than the night shift guards. He had helped design the airflow baffles in 2008. At 11:52 p.m., he parked 3 blocks away in an employee lot that still used his old badge suffix. The leather jacket stayed in the truck this time. He wore dark coveralls that smelled of diesel and carried a battered toolbox whose latch still bore the faint outline of a removed company logo. The side entrance lock accepted the master key he had never returned. Inside, the hangar air carried the cold bite of aluminum and hydraulic fluid. Footsteps echoed. He moved like muscle memory, counting the paces he had walked 10,000 times before. The prototype sat on its stand under a single halogen. Elias set the toolbox down. Its lid opened with a soft click that sounded louder than it should. He unfolded the bar napkin on the workbench beside the fuselage and compared the original sketch to the current wing root fillet. The difference was 3 millimeters of curvature, enough to create the resonance flutter that had ruined every test flight. His fingers moved without permission, loosening access panels, sliding a calibrated shim into place. The adjustment took 93 seconds. He photographed the before and after with the cracked phone, then wiped every surface with a microfiber cloth that left no lint. The napkin went back into the wallet. The toolbox latched shut. He was out the service door at 1:04 a.m., heart hammering against ribs that suddenly felt too small. The design review started at 9 a.m. sharp in the glass-walled conference room on the 4th floor. Elias watched from the parking garage across the street, binoculars resting on the steering wheel. Vanessa stood at the head of the table in a charcoal Brioni suit, rose gold Patek catching the morning light every time she gestured. Her Italian loafers clicked once as she called the meeting to order. The two lead designers, both in their late 20s, both wearing company polos, presented slides that still listed the same fatal flaw. Elias could almost hear the tremor in their voices through the closed windows. Then the telemetry feed from the overnight tunnel run appeared on the projector. The flutter was gone. The numbers danced in clean green lines. Silence filled the room for 4 full seconds. Vanessa's polished fingernail tapped the conference table once. "Run it again," she said, voice tight. The replay confirmed it. The prototype had suddenly, mysteriously, become viable. One of the designers let out a shaky laugh. Vanessa did not laugh. She excused herself at 9:47 a.m., walked to her corner office, and closed the blinds. Elias lowered the binoculars. The bar napkin in his wallet felt warmer than the morning air. He drove Sophie to a dentist appointment at 10:30 a.m., the leather jacket folded on the back seat like a silent passenger. In the waiting room, she leaned against his arm and whispered, "The airplane in my picture flew last night, didn't it?" He kissed the top of her head and said nothing. The small reversal tasted sweet, but the championship qualifier now sat at 31 hours away, and the board meeting that would decide the entire contract was still 5 days distant. 29 hours to the qualifier. Elias spent the morning in the basement of the old Union Hall on Gresham, flipping through personnel files that had never been digitized. The same retired floor supervisor from Day 5 met him there at 8:15 a.m., carrying a battered thermos of coffee that smelled like burned chicory. They spoke in the same low tones. The old man slid across a single manila envelope containing a signed affidavit from 2009, witnessed by 3 machinists who had since passed, attesting that the core geometry had been submitted by Elias M. Voss, callsign Ghost 17. The paper crackled when Elias touched it. He folded the bar napkin next to the affidavit on the folding table, a quiet ritual now. The old man watched the gesture and nodded once, eyes glassy. "You kept that damn thing all these years." The audit team returned with fresh eyes after the tunnel miracle. Vanessa pushed them harder, voice clipped, her Patek flashing every time she checked it. Elias received a terse voicemail at 2:38 p.m. from an unknown number. Someone inside legal asking if he would be available for a quiet conversation. He deleted it. Instead, he drove to the scrapyard on the edge of town where the original rejected prototypes had been sent. The foreman, a man with grease permanently etched under his nails, recognized the leather jacket Elias wore that afternoon. "Haven't seen that cut since the Ghost flew," he said. He let Elias walk the rows of rusting fuselages until he found the exact airframe from the 2009 test. The serial plate had been pried off, but the rivet pattern matched the napkin sketch exactly. Elias took 12 photographs, paid the foreman $300 in cash, and left before the afternoon shift change. Sophie waited at the library again, this time with a new drawing. 2 stick figures, one big, one small, standing under an airplane that now had the number 17 painted on its tail. She slid it across the table at 4:12 p.m. Elias pinned it in the truck next to the first one. The leather jacket hung from the rearview mirror like a promise. The whiskey and grease scent drifted through the cab every time he turned a corner. 21 hours until the championship qualifier. The first Real crack appeared in Vanessa's armor. She canceled the afternoon design review and instead called an emergency meeting with the 2 lead designers. Elias learned this from a single text, sent anonymously from a burner, detailing that she had begun asking pointed questions about missing original documentation. He read the message while sitting on a bench outside the federal courthouse at 11:19 a.m. The bar napkin unfolded on his knee like a map only he could read. The wind carried the distant smell of jet fuel from the runway 4 miles away. He refolded the napkin with deliberate care and walked back to the truck. That night, another nightmare gripped Sophie at 1:57 a.m. She woke crying, clutching the leather jacket she had dragged into her bed again. Elias carried her to the window as before. The runway lights blinked in sequence. Red, white, green, like a heartbeat. "Every plane that leaves comes back," he whispered. The same words, the same rhythm. Sophie's breathing slowed against his shoulder. He felt the weight of the wallet in his back pocket, the napkin inside it now joined by the affidavit and the new photographs. The championship qualifier was now less than 17 hours away, and the board meeting that would decide everything sat on the horizon like gathering thunder. The small victories kept arriving in the dark. A quiet affidavit here, corrected prototype there, each one another RPM closer to the truth. But the public arena was still coming, and Elias Voss, once called Ghost 17, still had miles of runway left before anyone remembered his name. The leather jacket smelled faintly of old jet fuel every time Sophie pulled it tighter around her shoulders. 19 hours until the championship qualifier. Elias sat in the back row of the hangar's public observation deck at 6:03 a.m., baseball cap low, watching the night crew wrestle with the prototype's hydraulic lines. The smell of hydraulic fluid and burnt coffee hung thick in the recycled air. Vanessa strode past below in her charcoal Brioni suit, Patek flashing under the overheads, barking orders that echoed off the corrugated steel. She still looked untouchable, but her voice cracked once on the word documentation. A half-second hesitation that only someone who had flown 287 missions would notice. Elias slipped out before first light. He drove the old Ford to the storage unit on Industrial Parkway, unlocked the corrugated door at 6:47 a.m., and pulled the tarp from the second crate. Inside lay the original stress test logs, stamped with his own faded signature, Ghost 17, clearance level that no longer existed on any current roster. He photographed 3 pages with his burner phone, then sealed them inside a plain manila envelope. The bar napkin went back into his wallet like a talisman. Its coffee stain had faded to the color of dried blood. By 8:14 a.m., the envelope was on the desk of a retired FAA inspector named Marcus Hale, a man who owed Elias a debt from a classified bailout over the Black Sea in 2009. Marcus didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, slid the envelope into his own battered briefcase, and said, "This stays between ghosts. 14 hours until the qualifier." The second crack came at 10:22 a.m. in the form of a frantic voicemail from one of Vanessa's senior engineers, a woman named Ruiz whose voice shook with caffeine and fear. "They're questioning the wing root rivet pattern now. She's demanding the original CAD revisions. We don't have them, Mr. Voss. I don't even know who does." Elias listened to the message once, then deleted it. He was standing in the elementary school parking lot at the time, waiting for Sophie's dismissal bell. The leather jacket lay folded on the passenger seat like a sleeping child. When Sophie climbed in at 3:05 p.m., she carried another drawing. The big stick figure now wore goggles and stood on top of the airplane instead of under it. The number 17 on the tail had been colored in with careful red crayon. He pinned it beside the others. The cab filled again with that familiar whiskey and grease scent as they drove toward the storage unit. Sophie fell asleep against the door before they reached the highway on-ramp. Her small fist still curled around the jacket's zipper pull. Inside the unit, Elias opened the third crate. He removed a single carbon fiber spar cap, the very piece that had failed during the first doomed test flight 3 years earlier. The fracture line was clean, textbook. His fracture line. The one Vanessa's team had blamed on material fatigue from undocumented suppliers. He photographed it under the bare bulb at 4:41 p.m., timestamp visible. Then he drove the evidence to a quiet cafe on 9th Street where Marcus waited in a corner booth. The handoff took 11 seconds. No words, just the faint clink of ceramic mugs and the smell of burnt espresso. 17 hours to the qualifier. That night, the nightmare returned at 2:29 a.m. Sophie woke, screaming about fire in the sky. Elias carried her to the window again. Leather jacket draped over both of them like a shared skin. The runway lights pulsed, red, white, green, in perfect sequence. He whispered the same promise against her hair. Her breathing evened out by the third repetition. When she was finally asleep, he carried her back to bed, then sat at the kitchen table until dawn, turning the bar napkin over and over in his hands. The affidavit now had 3 additional signatures. The wallet felt heavier with every passing hour. 11 hours until the championship qualifier. The mini-crisis arrived at 9:57 a.m. in the form of a locked conference room door and a security guard who didn't recognize the name on Elias's visitor badge. Vanessa had ordered an unscheduled audit of the entire documentation vault. 2 junior interns stood outside the glass wall looking pale. Inside, Vanessa paced in her spotless Italian shoes, pointing at empty shelves where the original blueprints should have been. Elias watched from the employee break room across the corridor, pretending to nurse a vending machine coffee. The smell of scorched plastic from the microwave lingered. He waited until Vanessa stepped out to take a call, then walked straight to the head of security, a man named Delgado who had once crewed a C-17 with him during the early days. "Need 5 minutes alone in the vault," Elias said quietly. Delgado's eyes widened at the sound of the old call sign. "Ghost. Jesus. They told us you were dead." "Not yet." The guard looked once toward Vanessa's retreating back, then swiped his MasterCard. The vault door clicked open at 10:12 a.m. Elias moved like muscle memory. He found the single missing folder wedged behind a row of unrelated maintenance logs. His own handwritten notes from the 2017 flight test campaign, the ones that proved the redesign had been rushed to meet a quarterly earnings target. He photographed every page in 90 seconds flat. The shutter sound was the only noise in the chilled room. When he stepped back into the hallway, Delgado was sweating. "Never saw you," the guard muttered. Elias nodded once. "Tell her the documentation isn't missing. It was just misfiled by someone who didn't want it found." He left the building at 10:41 a.m. The leather jacket waited in the truck like an old friend. Sophie had art class until 4, so he drove to the far end of the airport perimeter road and parked beneath the approach lights for runway 17. The whine of incoming turbofans rattled the windows every 90 seconds. He unfolded the bar napkin on the dash and added another line in neat block print. Vault access confirmed. Original test notes recovered. The sun climbed. The temperature inside the cab rose until the whiskey scent baked into the vinyl. At 1:17 p.m., his burner buzzed again. Another anonymous text. "She just fired the entire documentation team. 3 of them. Says someone is sabotaging her from inside the company. Board is demanding answers before the qualifier." Elias stared at the words until the screen went dark. Then he started the engine and drove back toward the city, the leather jacket swaying gently from the rear view like a pendulum counting down. 7 hours until the championship qualifier. The new crisis hit at 2:53 p.m. in the form of a process server waiting on the front steps of Elias's apartment building. The man wore a cheap suit and carried a thick envelope. Vanessa had filed an emergency injunction claiming corporate espionage. The papers named an unnamed former contractor and threatened immediate arrest if any more documents surfaced before the board meeting. Elias accepted the envelope without expression. The paper felt cold against his palm. He waited until the server left, then opened it on the hood of the truck while Sophie practiced cartwheels on the patchy grass nearby. The legal language was precise, brutal. Vanessa's signature at the bottom was trembling, barely noticeable, but there. The same tremor he had seen once before, years ago, when she had signed off on the rushed redesign that killed 4 test pilots. Sophie ran over, breathless, and tugged the leather jacket from the cab. She draped it around her own small shoulders and declared she was now co-pilot. Elias smiled, folded the injunction, and placed it in the wallet beside the napkin. The stack of evidence was now 2 inches thick. They drove to the storage unit one last time before dusk. Inside the 4th crate waited the flight recorder transcript from the fatal test flight, never declassified, never released. Elias had kept the only surviving copy. He transferred it to a fresh thumb drive, sealed it in anti-static plastic, and slipped it into the inner pocket of the leather jacket Sophie still wore. "Important cargo," he told her softly. She nodded like she understood. The sun dropped behind the hangars at 6:44 p.m. The runway lights flickered on in their familiar sequence: red, white, green. Elias stood at the chain-link fence with his daughter's hand in his, the jacket now back on its hook in the truck but carrying the faint new smell of jet exhaust and childhood sweat. 6 hours to the qualifier. The board meeting loomed larger now, a storm front visible on every executive calendar. Vanessa had begun sleeping in her office. Rumor said the lights never went off. Elias knew because the anonymous texts kept arriving, each one more desperate than the last. He read the newest one at 11:09 p.m. while Sophie slept curled against him on the couch. The leather jacket spread across them both like a blanket. The message was only 4 words long. "She's starting to remember." Elias stared at the glowing screen until it timed out. Then he closed his eyes and listened to the distant roar of a night freighter lifting off runway 17. The sound vibrated in his chest like an old familiar hymn. The napkin rested on the coffee table now, its edges worn soft from 1,000 careful unfoldings. Every new signature, every new photograph, every quiet reversal had been logged there in the same steady hand. The debt was still being collected, one procedural beat at a time. The public arena waited just over the horizon, engines spooling up, lights blinking in perfect sequence. And somewhere in the city, a woman in a Brioni suit was beginning to feel the first real weight of wings she had never earned. Elias woke at 4:17 a.m. to the low buzz of another anonymous text. He read it in the blue glow while Sophie dreamed beside him, her small fingers still clutching the sleeve of the leather jacket. The message read, "They're auditing the original certification logs. Help." He deleted it without answering, slipped the phone into his pocket, and carried Sophie back to her bed. The jacket stayed draped across the couch, smelling now of jet exhaust, childhood sweat, and yesterday's coffee. By 7:30 a.m., he was back at the storage unit, the metal door rattling open like a sigh. Inside the 5th crate waited a bundle of faded maintenance logs, each one initialed EH in the bottom right corner. He photographed them one by one, timestamped 0730 hours, then drove straight to a quiet cafe on Industrial Boulevard. There, at a corner table, sat Marcus Riley, former lead mechanic on the Horizon project, now 63 and retired. Elias slid the photos across without a word. Marcus adjusted his glasses, scanned the signatures, and let out a low whistle that rattled the ice in his water glass. "These are yours," he said quietly. "I remember the pen you used. Cheap blue Bic that leaked." Elias only nodded. He left a 20 on the table for Marcus's coffee and walked out. The first small reversal of the day was done. One more name added to the napkin in steady ink. The leather jacket waited in the truck, its inner pocket now holding a fresh thumb drive labeled Simply Logs 01. The qualifier race was 18 hours away. Vanessa's team had already painted over the faded Horizon decal on the prototype fuselage, cheap white primer that still smelled sharp in the hangar air. Elias watched from the public observation deck at 10:22 a.m. Sophie perched on his shoulders, licking strawberry ice cream that dripped onto the leather jacket's collar. A single drop landed on the faded squadron patch hidden beneath the outer shell. She didn't notice. Inside the hangar, a new crisis unfolded exactly on schedule. One of the test pilots, arrogant kid named Kyle with mirrored Oakleys, refused to fly the modified airframe until the center of gravity data was re-verified. The board had demanded the flight happen at 2 p.m. sharp for the live-streamed qualifier. Panic rippled through the engineering bay like static. Vanessa's voice cut across the floor at 11:03 a.m., crisp and edged with exhaustion. Find someone who actually knows what they're doing, or we pull the plug right now. Elias felt the words settle in his chest the same way turbulence once did at 30,000 feet. He set Sophie down, handed her the jacket like a cape, and walked to the side entrance. No one stopped the quiet mechanic in the oil-stained coveralls. He found the weight and balance sheet taped to a workbench, scanned the handwritten corrections in red ink, and made 3 precise pencil marks that only an original designer would recognize. Then he folded the sheet, placed it in the pilot's helmet resting on the adjacent stool, and left without a sound. The leather jacket was back on its hook in the truck by the time the noon whistle blew. At 1:47 p.m., Kyle climbed into the cockpit, visibly rattled. The headset crackled. Over the open channel that fed directly to the observation deck, the young pilot's voice suddenly changed. Center of gravity verified. These numbers, they're perfect. Whoever fixed this knew the old Horizon specs cold. Vanessa stood 10 feet from Elias on the deck, arms crossed so tight her Brioni jacket creased at the elbows. Her Patek Philippe caught the sun at 1:52 p.m. and flashed like a warning. She said nothing, but her jaw tightened when the aircraft lifted off runway 17 at 2:04 p.m. exactly on the corrected trim, and the live telemetry feed showed 0 deviation. The small crowd of executives and sponsors murmured. One older board member, a man named Hargrove who still wore the same tie from the original Horizon launch, glanced sideways at Elias and narrowed his eyes. Recognition flickered there, faint as a distant NAV light. That night, the napkin gained 2 fresh lines. The leather jacket lay across Sophie's lap in the truck while they ate drive-through tacos at 9:33 p.m. She traced the squadron patch with one sticky finger. "Daddy, why does it smell like airplanes?" He smiled in the dark. "Because it used to fly with the best ones." 19 hours to the full board presentation. The new crisis arrived at 6:12 a.m. in the form of a certified letter slid under the apartment door. Horizon Aerospace was suing the storage unit facility for unauthorized removal of proprietary test materials. The fine listed at $187,000. Elias read it while the coffee maker hissed on the counter. Sophie was still asleep, the leather jacket now her official night blanket, one sleeve tucked under her cheek. He made 3 calls, the first to Marcus Riley again, the second to a retired FAA investigator named Captain Lena Torres, who had flown with him on 287 missions before the accident that changed everything. The third went to a quiet law firm downtown whose founding partner still kept a yellowed photo of Elias in uniform on his desk. Each conversation lasted under 90 seconds. Each ended with the same sentence from Elias. "I need the original chain of custody forms. Nothing more." By 10:45 a.m., the countersuit paperwork was already being prepared, invoice number 4471 attached, referencing the very test flight recorder transcript now resting in the jacket's inner pocket. Elias drove to the storage unit one more time at dusk. The sun dropped at 6:51 p.m. this time, painting the chain link fence blood orange. He stood with Sophie's hand in his again, listening to the runway lights click on in their familiar sequence. Red, white, green. The same night freighter lifted off runway 17 at 11:14 p.m. Its engines sounded deeper tonight, almost like an apology. Vanessa sent another text at 2:19 a.m. This one was longer. The old flight data doesn't match what we published. They're asking questions I can't answer. I think I remember your voice from the radio that day. He read it twice, then placed the phone face down. The leather jacket was spread across them both again, its faint smell of jet exhaust mixing with the strawberry ice cream stain that refused to wash out. He unfolded the napkin under the lamp. The list of names and dates had grown to 23 entries, each one a quiet reversal. Each one another brick pulled from the wall Vanessa had built around a legacy that was never hers. The public arena was now 36 hours away, but the grind continued, steady as a propeller ticking over at idle. The latest mini-crisis hit at 8:07 a.m. when the prototype's primary flight control software suddenly threw error code 719, uncommanded surface deflection. The hangar went silent except for the high-pitched alarm that drilled into every skull. Vanessa stormed in wearing the same Brioni suit from yesterday, collar unbuttoned, hair slipping from its usual tight knot. Her Italian heels clicked unevenly across the concrete. "Fix it or we're finished," she snapped at the lead engineer. "The entire board is flying in tonight. This cannot happen." The engineer stammered. The clock on the wall read 8:14 a.m. Elias, dressed again in the coveralls no one ever really looked at, stepped forward holding a single worn maintenance manual. The cover was stamped Horizon Alpha, property of test pilot E. Harlan. He didn't speak. He simply opened it to page 147, laid it beside the diagnostic laptop, and pointed to a single handwritten annotation in the margin. His own handwriting from 15 years earlier. The numbers matched the exact offset needed to silence the alarm. The engineer typed them in. The error code vanished at 8:22 a.m. The alarm died with a soft click that echoed like a judge's gavel. Vanessa stared at the manual, then at the quiet man in coveralls. For the first time, her eyes lingered on the faint scar that ran along his left jaw, the one he got pulling a burning crew chief from a wreckage on runway 9 in 2009. Recognition moved across her face like a cloud shadow. She opened her mouth, closed it again. The Patek on her wrist read 8:27 a.m. when she turned and walked away without another word. Elias added one more line to the napkin that night. Sophie was asleep in the truck again, the leather jacket wrapped around her like armor. The faint new smell on it was jet exhaust, strawberry ice cream, and something else now, fear. Not his, hers. 31 hours to the board meeting. The debt was still being collected, one procedural beat at a time. The napkin's edges were softer than ever. And somewhere in a downtown office, a woman in a Brioni suit sat alone at 3:41 a.m., rereading old incident reports, the weight on her shoulders finally matching the wings she had worn for years without earning them. The truck's engine ticked softly in the pre-dawn cold as Elias turned the key at 4:12 a.m. 30 hours to the board meeting. He glanced at Sophie curled in the passenger seat, the worn leather jacket still draped over her like a shield. A single dried strawberry stain marked the collar from the night before. He tucked the napkin deeper into the jacket's inner pocket, its creases now thin as tissue, then drove east toward the hangars. At 5:47 a.m., the maintenance bay smelled of wet concrete and hydraulic fluid. 3 turbines sat stripped on engine stands, blades glistening under the overhead halogens. The new night shift crew, brought in at Vanessa's order, had misaligned the variable stator vanes on Unit 2 by 11 thousandths of an inch, enough to shred the compressor on first spin-up. The foreman, a thick-necked man named Reyes wearing a company polo 2 sizes too small, was already yelling into a phone. Elias walked past him without a word, coveralls still damp from the sprint across the tarmac. He carried nothing but a small torque wrench and the same maintenance manual. Page 203 this time. His faded ink from 2008 read, Stator preload must match blade root datum or resonance kills it at 87% N2. He set the book down beside the laptop. Reyes hung up mid-sentence. "You again," Reyes growled. "This ain't your sandbox, grease monkey." Elias said nothing. He simply reached past the man, spun the stator housing 3 precise clicks, and torqued the collar to 41 foot-pounds. The laptop's graph flattened. The projected vibration signature dropped from red to green in 4 seconds. Reyes blinked at the screen, then at the scar along Elias's jaw. "Call sign still on the inside cover, isn't it?" Elias murmured, so low only Reyes heard. "Harlan." The foreman's mouth worked once, twice. No sound came. He stepped back. The rest of the crew pretended to study their boots. At 6:03 a.m., the rain outside drummed harder, like distant applause that hadn't quite decided whose side it was on. Vanessa arrived at 7:55 wearing yesterday's Brioni again. Sleeves now rolled to the elbows, the Patek swapped for a simple stainless Seiko, her father's watch. She stopped 10 feet from the turbine stand. Her eyes found the open manual. Then the quiet man wiping his hands on a rag that smelled of 100 LL avgas and yesterday's fear. She didn't speak. She simply nodded once, the smallest motion, and kept walking toward the conference trailer. The debt ticked forward. 28 hours remaining. Mid-morning brought the second mini-crisis exactly on schedule. The fuel control software patch, rushed in by the board's chosen vendor, had corrupted the FADEC logic on all 4 test aircraft. At 10:41 a.m., the simulator froze mid-takeoff roll, red cascade warnings blooming across every screen. A $4.2 million hour of flight test data vanished into digital smoke. The lead software contractor, a man in pressed khakis and mirrored Oakleys named Klein, threw his headset across the room. "Re-image the whole damn cluster," he barked. "We'll be here till midnight." Elias was already moving. He carried no laptop this time, only a single 2009 flash drive the size of a dog tag. The label, handwritten in his own block letters, read Alpha Override. Do not use except Elias Harlan. He plugged it into the master station at seat 18C, the exact station he had occupied for 287 documented test flights. The drive bypassed every vendor lock in 11 seconds. Lines of legacy code scrolled upward like ghosts returning home. At 10:59 a.m., the simulator breathed again. The virtual runway unrolled smooth as fresh asphalt. The recorded data repopulate in neat green columns. Total loss prevented, $4.2 million. Time saved, 11 hours. Klein stared at the screen, then at the quiet man in coveralls. "Who the hell are you?" Elias met his eyes for the first time. "The guy who wrote the original flight envelope you just tried to patch over." He left the flash drive inserted. A small plastic rectangle with a faded American flag sticker. The same sticker that had once been on the napkin's original plastic sleeve. Sophie found him at lunch behind Hangar 3. She was holding 2 wrapped sandwiches and the leather jacket. The strawberry stain had been scrubbed but never quite disappeared. She handed him the jacket without a word. He slipped the napkin from the inner pocket, unfolded it on the tailgate, and added another line in the same careful hand. "Software restored. Eyes are starting to see." He refolded it and slid it back against her heart. The faint new smell on the leather now included warm roast beef and the distant ozone of live avionics. 17 hours to the board meeting. The afternoon ground on with procedural inevitability. At 2:34 p.m., the hydraulic test rig for the landing gear actuators began bleeding pressure at the exact rate that would have caused a catastrophic fail on runway touchdown. The technician on duty, a nervous kid named Morales, was close to tears. Vanessa stood 10 feet away, arms folded so tight the Brioni seams creaked. Her Seiko read 241 when Elias stepped in again. This time he brought nothing but a length of a 1/4-inch stainless tubing and the memory of 2006, when he had designed the actuator himself during a 41-day layover in Hangar 7. He replaced the cracked O-ring with one pulled from his own coverall pocket. still sealed in a 2009 parts bag. The pressure gauge climbed back to 3,100 psi and held. A soft hiss escaped the relieved lines, the sound of breath after a long submersion. Morales whispered, "Thank you, sir." Vanessa heard it. Her shoulders tightened another notch, but she didn't interrupt. She simply turned on one Italian heel and walked toward the operations office. The scar on Elias's jaw itched under her stare. 14 hours left. By 6:22 p.m., the sun had dropped behind the control tower, painting the tarmac in long blood orange stripes. The board members' Gulfstream was due at 8 o'clock sharp. In the ready room, the smell of burnt coffee and nervous sweat hung thick. Sophie sat on a plastic chair swinging her legs, the leather jacket now zipped to her chin. Elias stood at the window watching the line crew tow the last test aircraft into position. That was when the third mini-crisis arrived right on the clock. The telemetry antennas on the main tower had been recalibrated by the vendor team using civilian-grade GPS instead of the military-spec units Elias had specified in the original 2007 build. The error was 0.8 degrees of arc. On paper, it sounded tiny. In reality, it would throw every approach vector off by 147 feet at decision height, enough to turn a perfect landing into a smoking crater on national television when the board arrived. The vendor rep, a woman in a navy blazer with a $6,000 Rolex, was already blaming legacy infrastructure at the top of her lungs. Elias didn't raise his voice. He simply walked to the antenna control cabinet, popped the panel with a flathead from his back pocket, and began adjusting the ancient potentiometers by hand. 1 click. 2. The telemetry graph on the wall monitor realigned itself with surgical grace. The error dropped to 0 at 6:51 p.m. The vendor rep stopped mid-sentence. Her Rolex caught the fluorescent light like a guilty eye. Vanessa stood in the doorway the entire time. She watched every rotation of the potentiometer. When the graph settled, she exhaled once, slow and shaky. The sound of someone realizing the wings on her chest had always belonged to someone else. She didn't apologize yet. That would come later. But at 7:04 p.m., she turned to the vendor rep and said, quiet enough that only Elias and Sophie heard, "Get off my ramp." Then she looked straight at the man in coveralls. Their eyes locked for 3 full seconds. The scar, the manual, the napkin, the jacket, everything between them pulsed in that silence. 9 hours to the board meeting. Night settled over the airfield like a heavy blanket. Sophie fell asleep again in the truck at 10:19 p.m., the leather jacket pulled high around her ears. Elias added one more line by the glow of the dome light. She sees the shape of the debt now, still not ready to name it. The napkin's edges were fraying into lace. He tucked it back against his daughter's steady heartbeat. The truck smelled of jet exhaust, strawberry ice cream, roast beef, and the faintest trace of jet fuel courage. Outside, in the operations building, a light burned on the second floor until 4:07 a.m. A woman in yesterday's Brioni sat alone, surrounded by yellowed test logs, old incident reports, and one faded photograph from 2009 showing a young test pilot pulling a burning crew chief from wreckage on runway 9. The scar on his jaw was still fresh in the picture. She traced it with one trembling fingertip. The weight on her shoulders had grown wings of its own, and the countdown continued. The fluorescent hum of the second-floor office flickered once at 5:12 a.m. Vanessa rubbed her eyes. The Brioni jacket now rumpled across the back of her chair. The photograph from 2009 still lay face up on the desk. She slid it into a drawer as if hiding evidence. 6 hours and 48 minutes until the board meeting. Elias stood on the wet tarmac at 6:03 a.m., boots sunk an inch into pooled water, adjusting tie-downs on a vintage King Air that had limped in overnight. Sophie sat inside the truck cab, knees drawn up, drawing airplanes on the fogged windshield with one finger. The leather jacket hung over the passenger seat like a silent promise. He glanced at it every few minutes, the way other men checked their watches. At 7:41 a.m., the first new crisis landed. A black Suburban rolled through the security gate without slowing. Two men in crisp Navy suits stepped out, clipboards in hand. Federal Aviation Administration. Unannounced ramp inspection. The lead inspector, a man named Harlan with a voice like gravel in a tin can, pointed at the antenna cabinet Elias had touched the night before. That system failed its last certification cycle, Harlan said, tapping his pen against the metal door. Paperwork shows it was signed off anyway. Someone's head is going to roll today. Vanessa appeared at the operations door in fresh heels that clicked too loudly on the damp concrete. Her eyes found Elias across 20 yards of rain-slicked asphalt. For a heartbeat, she looked almost relieved to see him still there. Then the mask slid back into place. "Mr. Harlan, this is a misunderstanding," she began, the polished tone cracking at the edges. Harlan didn't look at her. He looked at Elias. "You, coveralls. You touched this cabinet yesterday. Vendor rep filed a report. Said you bypassed protocol. Care to explain before I shut this entire ramp down?" The rain drummed harder. Sophie pressed her small palm against the truck window, leaving a foggy handprint. Elias felt the napkin in his breast pocket, its frayed edges brushing the fabric above his heart. He walked forward slowly, water dripping from the brim of his baseball cap. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he pulled a battered leather logbook from the truck. Page 287 still marked with a paper clip from another life. He opened it under the shelter of the King Air's wing. The inspectors crowded in. Vanessa stayed 3 steps back, arms folded so tight her knuckles went white. Elias traced one line with a grease-stained finger. October 14th, 2009. Flight test 178. Same antenna array. Potentiometer drift at 12,000 feet. I recalibrated it mid-flight using a borrowed flathead and a roll of electrical tape. Signed off by Colonel Marcus Hale himself. Call sign Ghost Actual. That signature is still valid under FAA Part 43, subsection D. Look at the stamp. Harlan's eyes narrowed. He took the logbook, flipped pages. The rain hissed against the aluminum wing above them. At 8:09 a.m., the inspector's shoulders dropped half an inch. He handed the book back without a word. Vanessa stepped forward then. "So the system is legal?" "More than legal," Harlan muttered. "It's the original workaround. The one everyone copied and no one credited." He glanced at Elias again, longer this time. "You wouldn't happen to know the man who flew that mission, would you?" Elias closed the logbook with a soft thud. "He's retired. Life's quiet now. Raises a daughter. Fixes what other people break." The inspectors left at 8:47 a.m. "Nos chatdown. Nos aitaschens." Harlan paused at the gate long enough to look back once, as if trying to place a face he couldn't quite name. Vanessa watched the Suburban disappear into the gray curtain of rain. She turned toward Elias, lips parted, but the words never left her mouth. Instead, she walked back inside without speaking. The office light clicked on again at 9:02 a.m. 4 hours and 11 minutes until the board meeting. Elias climbed into the truck. Sophie handed him half a strawberry Pop-Tart she had saved from breakfast. The cab smelled of wet wool and sugar. He took a bite, then pulled the napkin free and laid it across his knee. The faded ink had blurred further in the humidity. Numbers, a date, a child's clumsy drawing of wings. Sophie traced one wing with her fingertip the same way Vanessa had traced the scar in the photograph hours earlier. "Daddy, is Miss Vanessa mad at us?" He folded the napkin once, twice, then tucked it back against her chest inside the oversized jacket. "She's figuring something out, kiddo. Same as the rest of us." By 10:30 a.m., the second mini-crisis of the day arrived in the form of a phone call. The parts supplier in Tulsa had canceled the order for the new actuator valves. $312,000 worth of hardware, due on the ramp by noon tomorrow for the demonstration aircraft the board expected to see fly. The manager on the line cited reallocation of inventory to higher priority clients. Translation: someone with deeper pockets and better connections had paid to bump them. Elias was under the belly of a Cessna 172 when Vanessa found him at 10:58 a.m. She held the phone out like it was evidence in a trial. "They won't budge," she said. Her voice had lost its boardroom steel. Sounded tired. Human. "If those valves don't show, the demonstration aircraft stays grounded. The board will see an empty hangar and a balance sheet bleeding red. They'll vote to sell the field. Everything." She waited for him to curse, to blame her, to walk away. Instead, he slid out from under the fuselage, wiped his hands on a rag that smelled of solvent and old leather. He took the phone, ended the call without speaking, then dialed a different number from memory. Area code 918. The man who answered on the second ring had a voice like a hangar door sliding open.
Ghost actual.
"Been a long time." Elias kept his tone even. "Need a favor, Dutch. 3 actuator valves. Same spec as the ones we used on the Raven program in '08. Invoice 4471 if you still keep the old numbers. Can you get them on a truck by 1400 today?" A low chuckle traveled down the line. "For you, I'll drive them myself. ETA 1345. And Elias, the old crew still talks about runway 9. You ever gonna tell people who pulled those boys out?" Elias looked across the ramp to where Vanessa stood watching him, rain dripping from the eaves onto her shoulders. "Not today." He ended the call at 11:03 a.m. The parts would arrive. The demonstration would happen. Another small reversal, another quiet stitch in the debt being repaid. Vanessa didn't thank him out loud. She simply nodded once, the gesture tight, then walked toward the fuel farm where a new leak had started at 11:17 a.m. A thin silver stream of jet A snaking across the concrete like a question mark. Elias followed at a distance. He carried a catch basin and 2 absorbent pads. When he reached her side, she was already on her knees in a $200 skirt, trying to stem the flow with paper towels that dissolved on contact. The smell of kerosene filled the air, sharp and nostalgic. He set the basin down without comment. Their hands worked in silence for 6 full minutes. At one point, her fingers brushed his. She pulled back as if burned. The scar on his jaw caught the gray daylight, and for the first time she let herself really look at it. By 12:04 p.m., the leak was contained. The truck bearing the actuator valves rolled through the gate at 1:37 p.m., 17 minutes ahead of Dutch's promised ETA. Elias signed for them using the name on his current ID. The driver, an old crew chief with a faded 2009 squadron patch on his sleeve, gave him a slow salute when no one else was watching. Vanessa observed the entire exchange from the second-floor window. She held the 2009 photograph in her hand again. The frayed napkin from the night before now rested on her desk beside it, placed there by Sophie, who had slipped into the office unnoticed at 12:52 p.m. The little girl had simply laid it down and left, as if returning a lost dog tag to its rightful owner. 2 hours and 9 minutes until the board meeting. The rain eased into drizzle by 2:15 p.m. Elias stood in the operations break room pouring black coffee into a chipped mug. The leather jacket hung on the back of a chair nearby, Sophie asleep on the couch beneath an old wool blanket that smelled of jet fuel and strawberry shampoo. The napkin was missing from his pocket now. He felt its absence like a missing tooth. Vanessa entered at 2:28 p.m. She carried 2 folders, one thick with red ink and failing projections, the other thinner, older, stamped classified across the tab in faded black. She set the classified folder on the table between them but didn't open it. "I looked up runway 9, she said, voice low enough that only the hum of the vending machine answered at first. "The official report lists the pilot as unknown.
Héroïque intervention.
Saved 3 lives. One of them was my father, Crew Chief Michael Reyes. He never told me the name of the man who carried him out of the flames." Elias took a slow sip of coffee. It burned all the way down. He said nothing. She continued. The board meets in 97 minutes. They expect me to present a plan that saves this place without outside capital. I don't have one. Not without. She glanced at the classified folder, then at the sleeping child, then at the empty pocket where the napkin used to rest. Not without the man who wrote those numbers on a napkin in a bar 15 years ago and told my father he'd be back to collect when the time was right. Elias set the mug down. The ceramic clicked against Formica like a timer reaching 0. Outside, the tower clock read 2:41 p.m., 79 minutes remaining. He reached into the jacket pocket Sophie still wore and withdrew the napkin. Its edges had frayed into near lace now, the ink almost ghostly. He laid it on top of the classified folder. The numbers matched a routing code on the first page inside. Vanessa's breath caught. Her manicured finger traced the same wing Sophie had traced hours earlier. The same wing the little girl had drawn on the foggy windshield at dawn. She looked up at him. The polished armor of her position had thinned to tissue. I fired you in front of the entire morning shift. I called you scrap metal. Elias met her eyes. The scar on his jaw tightened. You did. The silence stretched until the wall clock clicked to 2:44 p.m. Then Sophie stirred on the couch, murmured something about airplanes, and pulled the leather jacket higher around her small frame. The sound broke whatever trance held them. Vanessa stood abruptly, folders clutched to her chest like a shield. I need to prepare, she said. The tremble in her voice betrayed the words. She paused at the door. Will you be in the room when they vote? He gave the smallest nod. She left at 2:51 p.m. The office light stayed on. The photograph of the burning runway remained on her desk beside the empty coffee mug. The napkin stayed with Elias. The board meeting loomed like a storm front at 3:43 p.m., exactly 72 minutes away. Elias walked back onto the ramp, picked up a wrench, and began torquing the newly arrived actuator valves into place on the demonstration aircraft. Each click of the torque wrench sounded like another second ticking off a debt that had waited 15 years to be paid in public. Sophie woke at 3:57 p.m. and joined him, carrying the leather jacket now draped across her shoulders like a cape. She handed him tools without being asked. The two of them worked in the gathering dusk while the operations building glowed brighter against the coming night. At 4:12 p.m. another call came in. This one from the board chairman himself. The meeting had been moved up, 31 minutes until it began. The agenda now included an emergency motion to liquidate the entire airfield by end of week. Elias tightened the last bolt at 4:19 p.m. The aircraft sat ready. The antenna realigned. The valves installed. Every small reversal of the last 3 days stacked like cordwood beneath the single question that had burned since the moment Vanessa had ordered him to take his box and leave. The tower clock read 4:27 p.m., 28 minutes to the board meeting. He wiped his hands, picked up his daughter, and started toward the operations building. The leather jacket smelled of rain, jet exhaust, strawberry Pop-Tarts, and the slow, procedural shape of justice finally coming due. The napkin rested once more against his heart, its frayed edges catching on the zipper like tiny fingers refusing to let go. Vanessa waited in the hallway outside the boardroom, back straight, eyes red. She watched them approach. The scar, the manual, the child, the jacket, the numbers on the napkin. Everything between them pulsed again in the sterile light of the corridor. She didn't speak. She simply held the door open. Inside the boardroom, the air was thick with tension. The directors sat in a horseshoe of polished walnut, their faces lit by the glow of tablets and doubt. Vanessa took her seat at the head of the table, folders arranged before her like battle lines. Elias stood quietly at the back wall beside Sophie, the leather jacket now resting across the girl's lap. Vanessa began her presentation in a measured voice that only cracked once. She walked through the corrected telemetry, the restored software, the verified actuators, the realigned antennas. With each slide, she acknowledged the quiet fixes that had kept the prototype alive. Then she opened the classified folder and laid the original 2009 bar napkin on the projector. The circuit sketch glowed behind her, unmistakable. "This design was never mine," she said. The room fell completely still. "It belonged to the man standing at the back of this room. Elias Voss, Ghost 17. The patents, the logs, the flight data, everything we built this company on came from him. I took credit for it. I pushed him out. And for the last 17 days, he has been the only reason any of this still works." She turned to face the board, then looked directly at Elias. "I was wrong. The company, the qualifier, the future of this airfield, none of it belongs to me. It belongs to the hands that built it. I resign effective immediately and move that the board restore full ownership and patent rights to Elias Voss." A long silence stretched across the table. One by one, the directors nodded. The chairman's gavel came down at 5:03 p.m. Motion carried. The airfield was saved. The patents returned. The debt was paid. Vanessa walked the length of the room and stopped in front of Elias. For the first time, she looked small inside the Brioni suit. She reached out and placed the faded bar napkin in his hand. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Thank you for fixing what I broke." Elias looked at her for a long moment, then at Sophie beside him. The little girl smiled up at both of them. The leather jacket draped over her shoulders like a promise kept. He folded the napkin one final time and slipped it into the jacket's inner pocket. "Some things only need fixing once," he said. "The rest is just flying home." Outside, the runway lights blinked in sequence. Red, white, green, like a heartbeat finally steady. The championship qualifier was 23 hours away, but for the first time in 10 years, the sky above Detroit felt wide open again.